I wasn't looking for the lost architectural blueprints of a global empire. I was simply researching the mundane history of early modern paper production. Specifically, I was trying to track the logistical supply chains of oversized, high-tensile vellum used in the late 16th and early 17th centuries. My investigation was supposed to be a quiet, tedious journey through the ledgers of old Italian and French paper mills. I wanted to know how they managed to produce such massive, flawless sheets of drafting material without industrial machinery. But when you follow the paper, you inevitably follow the ink. And when you follow the ink, it often leads to the most guarded repository of human history on Earth, the Vatican Apostolic Archive. The archives are a fortress of paper, containing over 53 miles of subterranean shelving. It spans centuries of human triumph, tragedy, and, most importantly, administration. Access is famously restricted, heavily curated, and granted only to qualified scholars who must know exactly what they are looking for. Before they are permitted to request it, you cannot simply browse. You are handed what you ask for, and nothing more. But occasionally, human error occurs in the cataloging process. A misfiled folio, a misplaced index card. Through a digitized cross-reference of supply ledgers, I stumbled upon a highly restricted folio miscategorized under architectural capriccios, a term used to describe whimsical fantasy architecture drawn by artists purely for aesthetic pleasure. Look at the image on your screen. Zoom in on the lower left quadrant of this massive schematic. Notice the surgical precision of the line work. This is not a painting. This is not a romanticized sketch of a future cathedral. This is a technical blueprint of terrifying complexity. It depicts a sprawling, geometrically perfect star fort, overlaid with a massive structure featuring a series of interconnected copper domes and towering spires. But look closer at the cross-sections. They reveal a subterranean network of chambers that serve no known religious or residential purpose. There are deep, reinforced reservoirs, not meant for water, intricately lined with conductive metals. There are acoustic chambers mathematically proportioned to resonate at specific frequencies. And look at the doorways indicated by the scale marker at the bottom. They are designed for individuals standing well over 8 feet tall. The official explanation is simple, neat, and contained. We are told by the official narrative that these are merely the overactive imaginations of Renaissance and Baroque artists. They are described as utopian visions, impossible dreams, drawn to impress wealthy patrons and popes. The historians claim that because they lacked the engineering capabilities to build these structures, they simply drew them to express the grandeur of the human spirit. It is a comforting thought. It keeps our understanding of historical progress in a neat, linear box. But the official explanation collapses under the weight of basic engineering principles. Here's the mathematical contradiction. Fantasy does not require load-bearing calculations. A painter dreaming up a whimsical palace does not spend months calculating the precise stress ratios and tensile strength of iron-tied masonry. When modern structural engineers analyze these fantasy blueprints, they find an unsettling precision. The geometry is flawless. The structural math for domes that supposedly could not be built for another 200 years is perfectly balanced. You cannot accidentally design an atmospheric energy capacitor or a mathematically sound acoustic resonance chamber while merely doodling on expensive vellum. The logistics of the drawings themselves betray their true purpose. They are not fantasies. They are schematics for a technology we no longer understand, belonging to a civilization we have been taught to forget. We are forced to confront a deeply unsettling impossibility. If these were mere sketches, why are there thousands of them locked away in the dark? Why are they guarded with the same intensity as state secrets? The silence is deafening. We are looking at the foundational blueprints of the old world, a world of free energy, geometric harmony, and proportions that dwarf our modern capabilities. We did not slowly evolve into the architectural heights of the 19th century. We experienced a reset. We claimed their buildings as our own, and the true blueprints were quietly filed away in the vaults of the elite, labeled as fiction, so we would never think to build them again. Once you see it, you can't unsee it. If you are finding this investigation valuable, please subscribe to keep this research alive. And tell me in the comments, which city are you watching from? Have you noticed these anomalies in your own streets? Let us look at the physical reality of what these archived schematics demand. Look closely at the material specifications detailed in the margins of the Vatican folios. The ink clearly dictates the use of Cyclopean limestone blocks, seamless copper plating, and a type of geopolymer concrete that modern material science is still struggling to reverse engineer. If the official narrative is true, then we are expected to believe that pre-industrial societies, armed with nothing more than chisels, hemp ropes, and wooden scaffolding, executed these designs flawlessly. But when you consult actual structural engineers and construction logisticians, the math simply does not add up. Consider the sheer volume of labor and time required. The blueprints detail foundations plunging 80 feet into the earth, lined with perfectly cut, megalithic stone to stabilize resonant towers. To excavate that amount of soil and bedrock using 19th century hand tools, or earlier, would require a labor force of tens of thousands working uninterrupted for decades on a single site. Yet the official records, when they exist at all, often claim these monumental structures were erected in mere years. Look at the archival photographs of construction sites from the late 1800s. Zoom in on the muddy streets and the horse-drawn wooden carts. Now pan up to the towering, intricate facades of the buildings they are supposedly constructing. Do you see the mathematical contradiction? The logistical capacity of the era is completely divorced from the physical reality of the architecture. You cannot transport thousands of tons of flawless marble across continents on dirt roads without leaving a massive logistical footprint. Where are the supply chain ledgers? Where are the records of the immense funding required to sustain such impossible endeavors? The financial ledgers of the time cannot account for the sheer scale of the material used. Now let us examine the material science demanded by the stolen blueprints. Notice the detailed cross-sections of the copper domes in the archive drawings. These are not merely decorative roofs. The schematics show layered metallic components interspersed with specific geometric insulating materials, creating what appears to be a massive atmospheric capacitor. How do you smelt, roll, and perfectly join acres of high-grade copper at these altitudes without industrial welding equipment? The joinery in the stone beneath these domes is equally baffling. We are looking at mortarless joints so tight you cannot slide a piece of paper between them, cut with a level of precision that suggests they were molded or machined, not chipped away by an exhausted laborer with a hammer. If the official narrative is true, then these primitive workers possessed a surgical precision that our modern, laser-guided masonry tools can barely replicate. The acoustic properties mapped out in the Vatican folios push the boundaries of credibility even further. Look at the geometric calculations in the upper right quadrant of this page. These are calculations for acoustic resonance. The blueprints show internal chambers shaped specifically to amplify and sustain specific vibrational frequencies. To design a building mathematically optimized for acoustic resonance requires an understanding of wave dynamics and spatial geometry that supposedly did not exist at the time these documents were created. You cannot simply guess the exact curvature of a vaulted ceiling to achieve perfect cymatic harmony. It requires calculation. It requires a level of technological sophistication that the history books absolutely deny. The impossibility of these acoustics being an accident of primitive design is a mathematical certainty. Look again at the archival construction photos of the mid-19th century. Notice the lack of debris. Notice the lack of massive staging areas. The absence of the thousands of specialized craftsmen that would be required to carve the intricate lacework into the stone facades. When you build a structure of this magnitude, the staging area must be twice the size of the building itself. Yet, in city after city, from Paris to Melbourne to Chicago, we see these colossal, Greco-Roman and Beaux-Arts masterpieces sitting amidst muddy, unpaved streets, surrounded by wooden shanties. The contrast is visually jarring. If they possessed the engineering mastery to construct a flawless, geometric star fort and top it with a perfectly proportioned cathedral capable of cymatic healing, why couldn't they pave a road or build a functional sewer system for the common worker? This brings us to a deeply unsettling conclusion, a hypothesis that reframes our entire understanding of the built environment. It is the inheritance theory. What if the people in those sepia-toned photographs, the ones in the top hat standing proudly in front of magnificent mud-filled buildings, did not build them? What if we are essentially hermit crabs, wandering into the discarded, magnificent shells of a grander, more advanced civilization? The blueprints hidden in the Vatican are not aspirational drawings of a future we were trying to build. They are the confiscated technical manuals of the world we inherited. When the previous civilization was erased, their infrastructure remained. The elite of the 19th century did not commission these buildings. They simply dug them out, claimed them, and locked the original schematics away to control the narrative. We occupy these spaces, but we do not understand them. We wire these majestic atmospheric energy receivers for primitive, metered electricity. We partition their grand acoustic halls into cramped administrative offices. We are living in the ruins of a global empire, utilizing their superior technology in a completely inferior, degraded manner. We are the inheritors of a stolen realm, convinced by the official record that we are its creators. We did not build them. We found them. We dusted them off, altered the facades, chiseled off the original iconography, and slapped a new foundational plaque on the cornerstone. We are occupants. We are using a highly sophisticated piece of technology as a paperweight, completely unaware of the intended function of the device in our hands. Once you see the world through the lens of inheritance, the illusion of our steady, linear architectural progress shatters. The official explanation collapses entirely, leaving us alone in the massive, echoing halls of a stolen civilization. If the Vatican folio was an isolated anomaly, a single artist's mad dream locked away in a Roman vault, we could easily dismiss it. We could write it off as a historical curiosity, a footnote in the grand, linear narrative of human progress. But the true terror of this investigation lies not in the isolation of these blueprints, but in their terrifying ubiquity in the physical world. When we step out of the archives and look at the global map, the pattern spreads with a geometric precision that defies all conventional historical explanation. We are not looking at isolated incidents of architectural genius. We are looking at a standardized, worldwide grid of infrastructure. Let us move our focus to the aerial photographs. Look at the star fort of Bourtange in the Netherlands. Notice the mathematical perfection of the bastions, the precise angles calculated to deflect artillery, or perhaps to channel something else entirely. Now, pan across the globe to Hokkaido, Japan, and look at Goryokaku. It possesses the exact same geometric footprint, the exact same mathematical proportions. Now look at Fort Jefferson in the dry Tortugas off the American coast, or the Citadel of Halifax, or the fortifications embedded in the coastlines of South America, India, and Sri Lanka. We are told by the official narrative that these were independent military developments, constructed by different warring empires, speaking different languages, over several centuries. But the blueprints in the Vatican tell a different story. They show these star configurations not as mere defensive walls, but as foundational grounding mechanisms for the resonant structures built above them. When you overlay the Vatican schematics onto the aerial footprints of these global star forts, the lines match with surgical precision. The coordination problem becomes impossible to ignore. How do different cultures, allegedly separated by vast oceans and relying on wind-powered galleons for communication, independently invent and execute the exact same mathematically flawless geometric structures? They did not. You do not get identical, mathematically perfect architecture across 5 continents by coincidence. You get it through a unified global civilization that possessed standardized blueprints, the very blueprints now hidden in the shadows of the Vatican. The pattern extends far beyond the star forts. Look at the archival photographs of the grand post offices, the railway stations, and the Capitol buildings, constructed during the supposed boom of the mid to late 19th century. Zoom in on the General Post Office in Melbourne, Australia, circa 1880. Look at the massive Corinthian columns, the staggering height of the ceilings, the intricate masonry. Now look at a photograph of the Palacio de Correos in Buenos Aires, Argentina. Now look at the old Federal Building in Chicago, or the architectural remnants of old Shanghai, or the grand municipal buildings in Pretoria, South Africa. The official record claims these were built simultaneously by distinct nations undergoing their own localized industrial revolutions. Yet they all share the exact same Beaux-Arts and neoclassical DNA. They all feature the exact same impossibly large doorways, the identical vaulted ceilings, the ubiquitous copper domes, and the towering spires. They share the same geopolymer limestone construction, the same lack of chimneys despite being in freezing climates, and the same enormous windows extending all the way down to the street level, and often, mysteriously, disappearing beneath the mud and pavement. If we are to believe the institutions, we must believe that thousands of architects independently decided to design buildings that required the exact same impossible supply chains. We must believe that a fledgling colony in Australia, barely established according to the history books, had the identical logistical capacity, raw material wealth, and master craftsmen as the established capitals of Europe. It is a statistical and logistical impossibility. Calculate the shipping tonnage required to move that much quarried stone. Analyze the timelines. The ledgers do not exist because the construction never happened in the way we are told. Consider the spires and the domes. Across the globe, from the cathedrals of St. Petersburg to the state capitals of the American Midwest, we see the exact same copper-clad cupolas, topped with intricate metallic spires. The historians call them decorative weather vanes or religious ornamentation. But look closely at the Vatican cross-sections again. The schematics do not label these as decorations. They are detailed as functional components, drawing atmospheric energy down into the resonant chambers below. Why would every major city on Earth, regardless of its primary religion or political system, independently decide to cap its most important civic buildings with identical, highly complex, and incredibly expensive copper arrays? The answer is that they didn't decide to do anything. They simply inherited them. The pattern repeats because the original builders of this global grid used a standardized technological architecture. What we call colonial or neoclassical architecture is merely the physical residue of a single, unified, worldwide culture that was systematically erased from the historical record. When we map these buildings globally, we are not looking at the dawn of the modern age. We are looking at a forensic crime scene of global proportions. We are looking at the surviving nodes of an interconnected grid. The builders of this grid did not need to communicate across oceans via primitive ships to share architectural trends. They were already everywhere. They had mapped the Earth, calculated its resonant frequencies, and built their infrastructure in perfect harmony with it. The Vatican archives do not just hold the blueprints of a few European cathedrals, they hold the master plans of a stolen world. As you look at these comparative photographs, Melbourne, Paris, Buenos Aires, Chicago, Tokyo, ask yourself if the explanation of independent parallel development makes logical sense. If X is true, if these were built by disconnected horse and buggy societies, then Y must be false. They cannot possibly be perfectly identical in their underlying geometry, acoustic properties, and material composition. The visual evidence directly contradicts the written history. Once you see the global uniformity of this inherited architecture, you cannot unsee it. The illusion of a divided, slowly evolving world shatters, revealing the haunting silhouette of a unified empire that has been deliberately scrubbed from our collective memory. How do you hide a global empire? You cannot simply conceal a star fort under a tarp, nor can you easily bury a towering cathedral constructed of conductive copper and geopolymer limestone. To successfully execute a theft of this magnitude, the physical evidence that cannot be repurposed must be systematically eradicated. The blueprints locked in the Vatican were the theoretical threat, the mathematical proof of a lost civilization. But the buildings themselves were the physical threat. Look at the archival photographs of the great urban fires of the mid to late 19th century. Chicago in 1871, Boston in 1872, Seattle, San Francisco, and Melbourne. The official narrative provides us with a neat, comforting catalog of tragic accidents. A cow kicking over a lantern, a dry summer wind, a poorly timed spark. But zoom in on the panoramic photographs of the aftermath. Look at the rubble. Stone, brick, and structural iron do not burn like dry wood. Yet the images show cyclopean masonry pulverized into fine dust and heavy iron completely warped by temperatures that a simple wooden structural fire cannot physically reach. This is not the footprint of an accidental blaze. This is the signature of high-heat, coordinated demolition. And what occurs in the immediate wake of these supposed tragedies? A miraculous, impossible resurrection. The official record claims that these devastated populations, operating in the mud and ashes with horse-drawn carts and primitive hand tools, cleared millions of tons of debris and rebuilt their magnificent cities in a matter of months. Look at the new buildings erected immediately after the fires. They are massive, mathematically perfect Beaux-Arts structures, identical to the ones that supposedly just burned down. The mathematical contradiction is glaring. If modern construction firms cannot build these structures with such speed using mechanized cranes and laser leveling today, how did they do it then? The answer is that they didn't. They excavated what survived the cataclysm, cleared the superficial damage, claimed the remaining ruins as new construction, and filed the original operational blueprints deep within the Vatican and other restricted archives to ensure the true function of the grid was forgotten. But fire cannot explain the disappearance of everything. Some structures were simply too massive, too monumentally engineered to be secretly burned in the night. Enter the phenomenon of the world's fairs. Look at the sepia-toned panoramic shots of the 1893 Columbian Exposition in Chicago, or the 1904 St. Louis Fair, or the 1900 Paris Exposition. We are told by the institutions that these sprawling, geometrically flawless neoclassical cities, complete with artificial lakes, wireless ambient lighting, and massive conductive domes, were built purely as temporary exhibits. The official narrative insists they were constructed out of a fragile, impermanent mixture of plaster and hemp called staff. But look closely at the photographs of the construction phases. Notice the massive steel armatures. Look at the locomotives driving directly into the grand halls on reinforced tracks. If X is true, if these were temporary plaster facades built for a 6-month summer fair, then Y must be false. They could not possibly support the weight of thousands of people, massive industrial machinery, and torrential storms without melting back into the mud. Yet they stood with unsettling precision. And then, as soon as the fairs concluded, these magnificent, impossible cities were systematically and ruthlessly dynamited. Why would a society expend the GDP of a small nation to build a temporary utopia with permanent materials, only to immediately blow it to dust? It makes no logical or economic sense. But under the inheritance theory, it makes perfect, chilling sense. They were not building these fairs. They were walling off existing, surviving Tartarian infrastructure. They hosted grand, heavily curated exhibitions to show the surviving population the new, industrial narrative, to re-educate them on what technology supposedly was. And then they publicly executed the old world with explosives. It was a demolition of memory disguised as a celebration of progress. The physical erasure of the architecture was paired with an aggressive purge of the paper trail. We must carefully speculate about a 19th century reset window as a hypothesis, a period of profound demographic and infrastructural turnover. Between roughly 1850 and 1920, the historical record is a chaotic, contradictory blur. This is the era of the mysterious orphan trains, where hundreds of thousands of children with no memory of their parents or their past were shipped across continents to repopulate the empty territories. It is the era of massive, megalithic lunatic asylums built to house those who perhaps remembered too much of the old world. When independent researchers approach the established historical bodies to ask these questions, when they formally request access to the deeper vaults of the Vatican Apostolic Archive, or the basement storage of the Smithsonian, or the closed architectural wings of the British Museum to cross-reference the impossible timelines, the requests are uniformly denied. The institutions simply refuse to answer. The silence is deafening. What survived the fires and the dynamite was quietly rebranded. A massive atmospheric energy gathering station, its copper dome stripped of its functional antenna, is suddenly labeled a state capital. A cymatic acoustic healing center, its perfectly proportioned resonance chambers, divided by cheap wooden drywall, becomes a post office. They chiseled the original crests off the facades, replaced them with the names of wealthy industrialists and robber barons, and completely rewrote the ledgers to reflect a new history. Look at the early photographs of these cities in the 1860s. The streets are lined with breathtaking, six-story masonry, but they are eerily empty. We are told the camera exposure times were too slow to capture moving crowds. But we see the bootblack standing perfectly still on the corner. We see the horses waiting patiently at the curbs. The streets are not blurred, they are empty. It looks exactly like a newly inherited city, scrubbed clean, its true blueprints locked away in a Roman vault, quietly waiting for its new, bewildered occupants to be told who they are. When you finally comprehend the sheer scale of the erasure, the investigation shifts from a logistical puzzle to a profound, lingering grief. The blueprints locked away in the Vatican Apostolic Archive are not just technical schematics for stone and copper, they are the geometric proof of a lost utopia. Imagine the world those documents describe. Paint the picture in your mind, based on the physical evidence they could not fully dynamite or burn. It was a world defined by an impossible, effortless abundance. The architecture was not merely functional or aesthetic, it was interactive. The towering copper domes and intricate spires were not religious symbols, but atmospheric energy receivers, pulling free, boundless power directly from the ether. The cities were bathed in a soft, omnipresent luminescence, free from the choking smog of coal and the fragile, metered grids of modern electricity. The sweeping, cymatic arches and vaulted ceilings of their grand halls were surgically tuned to resonant frequencies, bathing the population in acoustic waves designed for cellular health and harmony. In the world before the reset, beauty was not a luxury reserved for the elite. It was the very foundation of the infrastructure. Every bridge, every waterway, every public square was constructed with an unsettling precision that elevated the human spirit simply by standing within it. Now look out your window at the modern world they gave us to replace it. Look at the brutalist concrete boxes we call municipal buildings. Look at the tangled, hazardous webs of power lines strung up on rotting wooden poles, metering out energy that we must labor our entire lives to afford. We are surrounded by planned obsolescence, cheap drywall, and crumbling asphalt. We live our lives in a state of perpetual exhaustion, navigating a gray, degraded landscape that is fundamentally hostile to human flourishing. We have been conditioned by the official narrative to view this brutalism as progress. We are taught to look back at the people who allegedly built the magnificent star forts and geopolymer cathedrals with a sense of paternalistic pity, believing they were primitive, superstitious peasants. But the mathematical contradiction of our reality proves the exact opposite. We are the primitive society. We are the degraded culture. We are the scavengers living in the grand, echoing ruins of a civilization that possessed a profound understanding of the Earth's natural electromagnetism and geometric order. The true horror of the inheritance theory is not just that we were lied to about the dates on a cornerstone. It is the realization of what was stolen from us. We were robbed of our birthright. The architects of the Great Reset did not simply destroy a competing empire, they downgraded the human experience. They took a decentralized, harmonious grid of free energy and acoustic healing, and they replaced it with a centralized system of scarcity, extraction, and control. They hoarded the blueprints, hiding them in the restricted vaults of the Vatican and other elite repositories, so that we would never remember how to build a society of abundance. They forced us to become dependent on their coal, their oil, and their pharmaceutical monopolies. The melancholy that settles over you when you realize this is profound. It is the grief for a future we were supposed to have, a future that was already built, fully operational, and subsequently demolished right in front of our ancestors' eyes. We are mourning a world we never got the chance to know. You begin to understand why the institutions must maintain the narrative with such desperate ferocity. If the general population ever fully grasped the reality of the architecture that surrounds them, the entire economic and power structure of the modern world would collapse overnight. If X is true, if the grand post offices and state capitals were originally free energy capacitors, then Y must be false. Our current system of forced scarcity is not a natural necessity, but a fabricated prison. The elite are not our innovators. They are our wardens. They are the inheritors of the grand theft, sitting on the restricted archives, doling out fragments of suppressed technology only when it serves their mechanisms of control. The buildings we walk past every single day are the silent, towering witnesses to this grand civilizational murder. This is the point of no return. The architectural anomaly has become a psychological threshold. You can no longer walk down a historic downtown street and see a simple bank or a 19th century library. You will look at the massive limestone columns, the impossibly large double doors designed for beings of a different stature, and the intricate, oxidized copper cupolas, and you will know. You will see the ghost of Tartaria trapped within the hijacked facade. You will feel the tragic weight of the mud that buried their lower levels, and you will hear the deafening silence of the history books that refuse to acknowledge their true origin. The illusion of the linear, progressive modern world has been permanently shattered by the sheer physical impossibility of its own claimed achievements. The world has changed shape around you. Once you see it, you can't unsee it. So where does this leave us? We are standing in the shadows of a profound mystery, holding the fragmented memories of a civilization that the official record refuses to acknowledge. The blueprints locked in the Vatican Apostolic Archive are just one piece of a massive global puzzle that has been deliberately shattered and scattered. If the institutions are telling the truth, then we must accept a reality built on mathematical contradictions, impossible logistics, and a sudden, inexplicable worldwide architectural uniformity. We must believe that men with primitive tools and horse-drawn carts perfectly executed the geometric harmonies of the cosmos, only to immediately forget how they did it. But if the inheritance theory is correct, we are looking at the greatest crime in human history. We are looking at the systematic theft of our potential as a species. Who were the original architects? What catastrophic event, whether natural or engineered, allowed for this global reset window to close so tightly over our past? And most importantly, what else is hidden in those 53 miles of subterranean shelving beneath Rome? Are there operational schematics for the free energy devices that once sat atop the oxidized copper domes? Are there maps of the lost infrastructure that was swallowed by the mud, waiting to be excavated? We may never gain full access to those archives. The institutions guard these secrets with surgical precision because they know that to reveal the true blueprints is to surrender the illusion of their authority. But they cannot hide the physical buildings that remain. They cannot erase the impossible masonry, the resonant acoustic chambers, and the towering spires that still anchor our modern cities. We do not need their permission to look at the world with open eyes. The architecture speaks for itself. It tells a melancholic story of a beautiful, abundant world that was violently replaced by the machinery of extraction and centralized control. The question is no longer whether we were lied to about the origins of our built environment. The question is what we do now that we can finally see the cracks in the official narrative. The evidence is all around us, waiting for you to see it. If this video resonated with you, please like and share it to help break the algorithm's silence. Subscribe for the next part of the investigation. The truth is waiting.